The autumn rain fell in sheets across the Pennsylvania countryside that October evening in 1949, turning the unpaved roads into rivers of mud. Inside the cramped cabin of a battered Ford truck, 5 people sat in tense silence, their breath fogging the windows as they traveled deeper into the Allegheny Mountains. James Whitmore gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes straining to see through the downpour. At 32, he was the oldest of the group, a former Army engineer who had seen things during the war that still haunted his dreams. Beside him sat his younger sister, Eleanor, 28, a schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers and a mind sharp enough to cut glass. In the back, squeezed between crates of surveying equipment, were 3 others. Marcus Chen, a 25-year-old geologist whose family had fled San Francisco after years of persecution. Rebecca Hoffman, a 29-year-old photographer whose camera never left her neck. And Thomas "Tommy" Sullivan, barely 21, a mechanic from Pittsburgh who could fix anything with an engine. They were an unlikely team, brought together by the Geological Survey Bureau to map an unexplored section of the Appalachian Tunnel System. The war had interrupted such civilian projects, and now, 4 years after VJ Day, the government was eager to catalog the nation's natural resources. This particular assignment had come with unusual urgency, and an equally unusual amount of money. Enough that none of them had asked too many questions. "There," Marcus said suddenly, pointing through the rain-streaked windshield. "The entrance should be just past that outcropping." James eased the truck to a stop before a massive opening in the mountainside, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of their headlights. The tunnel entrance was larger than any of them had expected, easily 30 feet high and wide enough to drive a train through. Strange mineral deposits ringed the opening. Crystalline formations that caught the light and threw it back in colors that seemed just slightly wrong. Purples that were too deep, greens that were too bright. "Jesus," Tommy whispered. "That's not on any of the survey maps." Eleanor pulled out the worn topographical charts they'd been given. According to these, this tunnel was supposed to be a minor cave system, barely worth noting. This is something else entirely." Rebecca was already out of the truck, her camera clicking despite the rain. She moved closer to the entrance, professional instinct overriding caution. "Look at the rock formations," she called back. "I've never seen anything like this. It's almost like they're growing." James killed the engine and climbed out, immediately soaked by the rain. The others followed, drawn by a mixture of professional curiosity and something else, a pull they couldn't quite name, a sense that something significant waited in the darkness ahead. Marcus approached the entrance, running his hand over the strange mineral deposits. They were warm to the touch despite the cold rain, and seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence. "This isn't natural," he said slowly. "Or rather, it's not like anything in the natural world I know. These formations suggest some kind of ongoing geological process, but the energy required would be—" He trailed off, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be possible. "We should document everything before we enter," Eleanor said, her teacher's practicality asserting itself. "Whatever this is, it's extraordinary." For the next hour, they worked in the rain, taking photographs, collecting samples, making detailed notes. The tunnel entrance seemed to watch them, patient and ancient. As they worked, each of them noticed something odd. The rain didn't fall inside the tunnel mouth. It was as if an invisible barrier existed a few feet inside the entrance, beyond which the air was dry and strangely still. "I don't like this," Tommy said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Something's wrong here. We should report back, get more people, more equipment." But James was already making the decision. "We're here now. We have our equipment, our supplies. The Bureau wants a preliminary report by the end of the month. If we turn back now, it'll be weeks before we can organize another expedition." What he didn't say, what none of them wanted to acknowledge, was that they were all drawn to the tunnel in a way that defied logic. It called to something deep inside them, a resonance they felt in their bones. They loaded their equipment and re-entered the truck. James started the engine and slowly drove through the invisible barrier into the tunnel. The moment they crossed that threshold, the sound of the rain vanished completely. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rumble of the truck's engine and the crunch of tires on stone. The tunnel was vast, far larger than any natural cave system. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered with those same strange mineral deposits. They glowed with a soft bioluminescence, providing enough light to see by even without the truck's headlights. The air smelled of ozone and something else, something that reminded Eleanor of the moment just before a lightning strike. They drove deeper into the mountain, the tunnel descending at a gentle but constant angle. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. The tunnel never branched, never changed course significantly. It simply continued downward, spiraling into the earth like a throat leading to the planet's stomach. "We've gone miles," Marcus said, checking his instruments. "We should have reached the other side of the mountain range by now. This doesn't make any sense." Rebecca was photographing constantly, her flash creating stark shadows on the tunnel walls. "Look at this," she said, pointing to markings on the stone. They weren't natural formations. They were too regular, too purposeful. Symbols and patterns that suggested intelligence, though not of any human culture any of them recognized. Eleanor copied the symbols into her notebook, her hand trembling slightly. She had studied ancient languages as a hobby, everything from Sanskrit to Mayan glyphs. These markings were similar to both and neither, as if they were the root language from which all others had sprung. The truck's radio, which had been playing big band music when they entered, had long since faded to static. Tommy tried adjusting the dial, but no matter where he turned it, he found only silence or a strange rhythmic pulse that sounded almost like breathing. "We need to mark our progress," James said. "Tommy, you're up." At regular intervals, they stopped and Tommy would spray paint a large X on the wall, along with the time and distance traveled. It was a precaution, a way to ensure they could find their way back. But with each stop, they all felt it, the sensation that time itself was behaving strangely. James's watch showed they'd been driving for 3 hours, but it felt both longer and shorter than that. Eleanor's watch showed a different time entirely, as if they were each moving through their own personal time streams. The tunnel began to change. The smooth walls gave way to crystalline structures that jutted from floor and ceiling like the teeth of some vast beast. The light they gave off grew stronger, shifting through a spectrum that seemed to include colors that shouldn't exist. Marcus tried to take readings with his instruments, but the needles spun wildly, unable to settle on any measurement. "We should turn back," Rebecca said, and this time there was real fear in her voice. "Whatever this is, it's beyond our understanding. We're not equipped for this." But turning the truck around in the narrow tunnel would be difficult, and none of them could shake the feeling that turning back was no longer an option. The tunnel had accepted them, swallowed them, and it would release them only when it chose to. They pressed on. The descent steepened. The air grew warmer, then hot, then comfortable again, cycling through temperatures that made no physical sense. At one point, Eleanor was certain she saw her breath mist in front of her face, even though her thermometer showed the temperature at a pleasant 72 degrees. The symbols on the walls became more frequent, more complex. In one section, they seemed to tell a story. Figures entering the tunnel, figures emerging changed. Or perhaps they were warnings. Eleanor couldn't tell. The more she looked at them, the more they seemed to shift and change, as if they were alive and responding to her attention. "Light ahead," James said suddenly. Real light. Daylight. They all felt a surge of relief. They had made it through, whatever through meant. The tunnel ahead brightened and they could see an opening, could see gray sky beyond. James pressed on the accelerator, eager to escape the oppressive weight of the mountain. They burst out of the tunnel into a world transformed. The first thing they noticed was the sound, or rather, the cacophony. The gentle rain they'd left behind had been replaced by a roar of mechanical noise, a constant thunder of engines and electricity that made them all wince. The second thing they noticed was the road. It was smooth, black, perfect, nothing like the dirt roads they'd driven on to reach the tunnel. And it was filled with cars unlike any they'd ever seen, sleek machines that moved at incredible speeds, their designs alien and aerodynamic. James slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop on the shoulder of what appeared to be a massive highway. Around them, cars honked and swerved, their drivers shouting things the group couldn't hear over the noise of traffic. "What the hell?" Tommy breathed, staring at the vehicles flashing past them. Rebecca's camera was already up, clicking frantically. "Those cars, those aren't prototypes, they're everywhere. And look at the signs." Massive green signs loomed overhead, directing traffic toward cities and towns. The signs were illuminated with lights brighter than anything they'd seen outside of Times Square. And the information on them: Interstate 76, Exit 23, Pittsburgh 45 miles, was printed in a font and style that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. Eleanor was staring at a billboard visible across the highway. It advertised something called a Big Mac, and showed a sandwich that looked like it had been constructed by a madman. 1993, she read from the small date on the bottom of the advertisement. That billboard says 1993. That's impossible, Marcus said flatly. That's 44 years in the future. We were in that tunnel for, what, 4 hours? 5 at most? James looked at his watch. It had stopped, the hands frozen at 8:47. He checked Eleanor's watch, also stopped but at 9:23. Tommy's showed 7:15. Rebecca's was still ticking, but the date window showed November 17th, 1993. A police car appeared, its lights flashing red and blue in a way that was both familiar and wrong. The officer who emerged was young, couldn't have been more than 25, and he wore a uniform that was similar to what they knew, but different in 100 small ways. He approached the truck cautiously, one hand on his belt where a radio crackled with constant chatter. "Folks, you can't stop here," he said, then stopped, really looking at them for the first time. His eyes widened as he took in the truck, their clothes, their equipment. "What is this, some kind of historical reenactment?" James tried to speak, but no words came. How could he possibly explain? The officer was looking at the truck more closely now, at the license plate that showed a Pennsylvania registration from 1949, at the style of the vehicle that belonged in a museum, at the 5 people inside who were dressed like they'd stepped out of a photograph from his grandfather's war albums. "I need to see some identification," the officer said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "All of you. Right now." They fumbled for their wallets, their identification cards. The officer examined them under his flashlight, his expression growing more confused and concerned with each one. "These IDs, they're dated 1949, all of them. Is this some kind of joke?" "Officer," Eleanor said, using her most reasonable teacher's voice, "I know this is going to sound insane, but we need your help. We entered a tunnel in the Allegheny Mountains approximately 5 hours ago. It was October 1949. We just drove through. And now you're telling us it's 1993. The officer stared at her, then at the others, then back at the tunnel entrance behind them. But when he looked, he saw only an unremarkable highway underpass, concrete and steel, nothing like the massive geological formation they'd emerged from. "That's just an overpass," he said slowly. "It's been there for 20 years. There's no mountain tunnel anywhere near here." They all turned to look. He was right. The tunnel was gone. In its place was an ordinary highway structure, completely mundane. Cars passed through it constantly, their drivers oblivious to anything unusual. "No," Rebecca whispered. "No, that's not possible. We just came through." But as they watched, the truth settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The tunnel had released them 44 years in the future, and in doing so, it had erased itself from this timeline, or at least from this location. They were stranded. 5 people from 1949 standing on the shoulder of a 1993 highway, with no way back and no way to prove where they'd come from. The officer was talking into his radio now, his voice tense. "Yeah, dispatch. I'm going to need backup at my location. And maybe send a psych eval unit. I've got 5 people here who are either the best actors I've ever seen or something really weird is going on." More police cars arrived within minutes. Then a supervisor. Then someone who identified himself as being from the Department of Homeland Security, a phrase that meant nothing to any of them. They were separated, questioned individually. Their truck was impounded, their equipment confiscated. Their identification cards were examined, tested, analyzed, and slowly, impossibly, the truth began to dawn on the officials around them. These people were exactly who they claimed to be. The truck was a genuine 1949 Ford, showing wear consistent with its apparent age but no more. The equipment was period accurate down to the serial numbers, which checked out against manufacturing records from the late 1940s. The identification cards used paper and ink that weren't made anymore, weren't available to forgers. Even their clothes, when analyzed by forensics teams, showed age and wear patterns that couldn't be faked. Most damning of all were the 5 people themselves. Medical examinations showed them to be in perfect health, their bodies showing no signs of the 4 decades they should have lived through. Their teeth had pre-fluoride cavities consistent with 1940s dental care. Their lungs showed none of the pollutants that had accumulated in the atmosphere since then. Blood tests revealed antigens and immunity patterns consistent with someone born in the 1920s and living in the 1940s. James, Eleanor, Marcus, Rebecca, and Tommy were moved to a secure facility, a nondescript building that looked like an office complex, but held secrets the government would never acknowledge. They were kept together, treated well, but watched constantly. Scientists and doctors studied them. Historians interviewed them. Psychiatrists evaluated them. And slowly, they began to understand the world they'd stumbled into. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Computers had gone from room-sized machines to devices that sat on desks in ordinary homes. Men had walked on the moon. Wars had been fought and won and lost in countries they'd barely heard of. The president was someone named Clinton. Music had changed. Fashion had changed. Language had changed. Everything had changed. They spent weeks in that facility, learning about the world of 1993, while government officials decided what to do with them. Some officials wanted to keep them secret, to study them indefinitely. Others argued they should be released given new identities, helped to integrate into modern society. A few suggested they might be Soviet sleeper agents, despite all evidence to the contrary. In the end, it was Eleanor who made the decision for them. She was being interviewed by yet another government scientist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who happened to be Marcus's great-niece, though neither of them knew it yet. Dr. Chen was sympathetic, kind, and Eleanor trusted her in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since they'd emerged from the tunnel. "What would you do?" Eleanor asked her. "If you were us? If you'd lost everything, your time, your place in the world, everyone you knew, would you want to hide or would you want to live?" Dr. Chen had thought about it for a long moment. "I'd want to live," she'd said finally. "I'd want to matter, to mean something. The world needs people who've seen both the past and the present who can bridge that gap. The world needs you." So they made a deal. The government would release them, give them new identities and enough money to get started, help them learn to navigate this new world. In exchange, they would remain available for study, for interviews, for the occasional consultation when questions arose about history or technology or culture from their time. They were released on a cold December morning almost 2 months after they'd entered that tunnel. They stood outside the facility, 5 people who'd lost 44 years in the space of a few hours, looking at a world that was familiar and alien in equal measure. "What do we do now?" Tommy asked, staring at the cars whizzing past on the nearby highway, each one a marvel of engineering that would have seemed like science fiction in his time. James looked at his companions, these 4 people who'd shared an impossible journey with him. "We survive," he said. "We learn, we adapt, and we find out why this happened to us." Because that was the question that haunted them all. Why? Why had the tunnel chosen them? Why had it thrown them forward in time? And most importantly, could they find their way back? None of them knew that the answer would come in time, and that the truth would be stranger and more terrible than anything they could imagine. The spring of 1994 found the 5 temporal refugees scattered across Pennsylvania, each trying to carve out a new existence in a world that had moved on without them. The government's promised assistance had been generous but impersonal. New social security numbers, driver's licenses with fabricated histories, enough money for a year's expenses, and connections to therapists who specialized in extreme displacement. None of the therapists had ever dealt with anything quite like this, but they did their best. James Whitmore had settled in a small town outside Philadelphia, working as a night security guard at a manufacturing plant. The solitude suited him. He spent his days sleeping and his nights walking the empty floors of the factory, thinking about everything they'd lost. He'd tried to find out what happened to his parents, his other siblings, but the government counselors had gently discouraged it. "You were declared legally dead in 1951, they'd explained. Your family had funerals, moved on. Finding them now would only cause pain for them and for you. So he didn't search. Instead, he watched the security monitors and thought about the tunnel. He'd written down everything he could remember about it, filled 3 notebooks with sketches and descriptions and theories. At night, when the factory was quiet, he would pull out those notebooks and study them, looking for patterns, for answers. Eleanor had taken an apartment in Pittsburgh and enrolled in community college under her new identity, claiming to be a woman in her late 20s, who'd been homeschooled by eccentric parents. She was catching up on 4 decades of history, reading voraciously, trying to fill the yawning gaps in her knowledge. The Cold War, Vietnam, Watergate, civil rights, women's liberation, AIDS, the internet. Each new piece of information was a shock, a revelation, a reminder of everything she'd missed. She'd tried to return to teaching but found it impossible. The children looked at her strangely, as if they could sense something off about her, something that didn't fit. She was too old-fashioned in her thinking, too shocked by things they took for granted, too confused by references they all understood. After 2 months as a substitute teacher, she'd given up and taken a job at a library instead. Books, at least, didn't change as fast as people. Marcus Chen had found work with a geological consulting firm, his expertise in traditional surveying techniques surprisingly valuable in an age where everyone relied on GPS and computer modeling. The other geologists found him odd, brilliant but out of touch, as if he'd learned his craft from textbooks written before the space age, which in a sense he had. He'd also discovered that his family had thrived in his absence. His parents, who he'd left behind in 1949, had built a successful restaurant business in San Francisco. His younger brother, who'd been 10 when Marcus disappeared, had become a prominent engineer. There were nieces and nephews, grandnieces and grandnephews, an entire family tree that had grown without him, and that now included Dr. Sarah Chen, the woman who'd helped secure their release. Marcus attended a family reunion that summer, claiming to be a distant cousin from the East Coast. He watched his brother, now an elderly man of 79, telling stories about the brother who'd vanished in the mountains in 1949, who'd been searching for tunnels and never came home. The old man's eyes were sad as he spoke, and Marcus had to excuse himself, overcome with emotion he couldn't show. Rebecca Hoffman had moved to New York City, drawn to the art and photography scene there. Her style was considered remarkably vintage, almost retro, and she'd actually managed to sell some of her work. She'd taken thousands of new photographs since emerging from the tunnel, documenting this strange new world with the eye of someone who'd seen it both young and old. But what fascinated her most were the photographs she'd taken inside the tunnel. She'd developed them carefully, using techniques she'd learned in the 1940s because modern digital processing felt wrong somehow. The images showed the tunnel as she remembered it, vast, crystalline, impossible. But there were other things in the photographs too, things she hadn't noticed when she'd taken them. Shadows that moved between frames, shapes in the crystalline structures that looked almost like figures. And in one photograph taken just before they'd emerged, there was something else. A face, vast and ancient, watching them from within the stone itself. She'd shown this photograph to no one, not even the others. She kept it in a locked drawer in her apartment, taking it out sometimes late at night to study it. The face was there. She was certain of it, even though it was made of shadows and light and stone, and it was looking at her, had been looking at her, would always be looking at her. Tommy Sullivan had struggled the most. The mechanics skills that had served him so well in 1949 were almost useless in 1994. Cars now were controlled by computers, by electronic fuel injection and digital diagnostics. He could barely recognize an engine block, let alone fix one. He'd taken a job at an auto parts store dealing with customers and trying to learn about these new machines, but it was slow going and often frustrating. He'd also started drinking. Not much at first, just a beer or two after work to quiet the anxiety that gnawed at him constantly. But it had grown, become a nightly ritual, then an afternoon habit, then a morning necessity. The world was too loud, too fast, too much. The only place he felt calm was at the bottom of a bottle, in that pleasant fog where nothing mattered and time became meaningless again. The others noticed, of course. They'd stayed in touch, meeting once a month at a diner halfway between their scattered locations. It was Eleanor who confronted him about it that July, her teacher's concern overriding her natural politeness. "You're killing yourself," she'd said bluntly, watching him order his third beer with lunch. "I understand why, Tommy. God knows I understand. But you're killing yourself and we can't lose anyone else." Tommy had stared at his beer for a long moment. "Sometimes I think it would be easier," he'd said quietly, "to just stop. We don't belong here, Eleanor. We're ghosts, haunting a time that isn't ours." "Then we'll be ghosts together," she'd replied. "But we'll be living ghosts. We'll matter. We'll mean something." It was James who'd changed the subject, pulling out his notebooks. "I think I figured something out," he'd said, "about the tunnel, about why it chose us." They'd all leaned in, eager for any explanation, any meaning to what had happened to them. James had spread out his sketches and notes across the diner table. "Look at the pattern of the symbols. Eleanor, you said they reminded you of proto-languages, root languages that came before all the others. What if they weren't recording language? What if they were recording something else? Time." "Go on," Marcus had said, his geological expertise making him follow James's reasoning. The tunnel spiraled downward, constantly, consistently, always descending. What if it wasn't going down in space? What if it was going down in time? Each revolution of the spiral took us further from 1949, further into the future. The symbols weren't a language. They were a timeline, a map. Rebecca had pulled out the folder of photographs she always carried, spreading them across the table. If that's true, then these might not just be random formations. They might be markers, waypoints. But why? Eleanor had asked. Why would such a thing exist? Who would build it? Marcus had been silent, staring at the photographs with a growing sense of unease. Not who, he'd said slowly. What? Look at this. He'd pointed to one of Rebecca's photos, at the crystalline structures that lined the tunnel. These formations aren't geological. They're not random. They're organized, purposeful. They're alive. The silence that had followed that statement was profound. They'd all felt it when they were in the tunnel, that sense of presence, of intelligence. But to have it stated so baldly, to consider the implications. If the tunnel is alive, James had said slowly, then it chose to take us forward in time. The question is why? What purpose do we serve? None of them had an answer, but they'd all agreed to keep searching for one. They'd formed a pact that day, the 5 of them, to document everything they could remember, to research everything they could find about similar phenomena, to be ready for whatever came next. Because they all felt it, that sense that their journey wasn't over. The tunnel had released them, but it hadn't let them go. It was still there, somewhere, waiting. The months passed. They adapted, slowly, painfully. James took computer classes at the local library, struggling to understand this new technology but determined to master it. Eleanor enrolled in graduate school, pursuing a degree in linguistics, fascinated by how language had evolved in the decades she'd missed. Marcus published a paper on unusual geological formations in the Appalachians, carefully avoiding any mention of tunnels or time displacement, but documenting the strange crystalline structures he'd seen. Rebecca had her first gallery show, her vintage photography style becoming unexpectedly popular. Tommy, with the others' support, joined Alcoholics Anonymous and began the hard work of staying sober one day at a time. They were surviving, but they weren't living. Not really. They existed in a strange limbo, people out of time, neither fully of the past nor completely of the present. They had no families, no roots, no histories beyond the fabricated identities the government had given them. They were permanent outsiders looking at the world through a glass darkly. It was Rebecca who saw the sign first. She'd been on the subway in New York when she'd noticed it, a small advertisement easily overlooked for something called the Temporal Studies Institute. The ad claimed to research temporal anomalies, displacement phenomena, and chronological irregularities. There was a phone number and an address in upstate New York. She'd called the number from a payphone, her hands shaking. A pleasant voice had answered, asking what kind of temporal phenomenon she'd experienced. Rebecca had hesitated, then hung up. It could be a trap, government surveillance, or worse. But she'd written down the address. At their next monthly meeting in August, she'd shown the others the advertisement. "We need to check this out," she'd said. "Someone else knows about this. Someone else might have answers." They'd debated it for hours. The government had been clear in their release agreement. They were free to live their lives, but they were to avoid drawing attention to themselves, avoid discussing their origins with anyone outside of official channels. Going to this institute could violate that agreement, could land them back in government custody. But in the end, curiosity and desperation won out. They'd made the drive to upstate New York on a Saturday in September, all 5 of them crammed into James's used car, following directions to an address that turned out to be an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of a small town. The mansion was imposing, 3 stories of weathered stone and dark windows. A small brass plaque by the door read, "Temporal Studies Institute, by appointment only." James had rung the doorbell, and they'd waited in nervous silence. The woman who'd answered the door was in her 60s with iron gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She'd looked at them for a long moment, then smiled. "You've experienced temporal displacement," she'd said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" Eleanor had asked. "You all have the look," the woman had replied. "The 1,000-yard stare, but focused on time instead of trauma. Come in. We have much to discuss." Her name was Dr. Margaret Aldridge, and she was a physicist who'd spent 30 years studying temporal phenomena. The institute was her life's work, funded by a combination of private grants and, she'd admitted with a wry smile. Government money from agencies that officially didn't exist. She'd led them to a library filled with books and papers and photographs, and there, spread across tables and pinned to walls, was evidence of others like them. Dozens of cases, maybe hundreds of people who'd experienced temporal displacement. Some had gone forward in time like them, others had gone backward. Some had skipped years, others decades. A few had jumped centuries. It's been happening forever, Dr. Aldridge had explained, but it's getting more frequent. The barriers between different times are thinning, or perhaps being deliberately weakened. We document the cases we can find, interview the subjects when possible, try to find patterns. Have you found any? Marcus had asked, his scientific mind already racing through the implications. Some. The displaced are almost always near geological formations with unusual properties, crystalline structures, magnetic anomalies, places where the Earth's normal rules don't quite apply. There are also always people who are, in some way, out of step with their own time. Seekers, questioners, people looking for something they can't quite name. James had felt a chill run down his spine. It was true. All 5 of them had been dissatisfied with their lives in 1949, had been looking for something more, something different. The tunnel had chosen them because they were already halfway to leaving their own time. What causes it? Rebecca had asked. The displacement, I mean. Is it natural or is something, doing this deliberately? Dr. Aldridge had hesitated before answering. Both, I think. The tunnels, the portals, whatever you want to call them, they exist naturally. Gaps in the fabric of time created by combinations of geological and electromagnetic forces we don't fully understand, but they're also being used. There's an intelligence behind some of the displacements, a purpose we haven't figured out yet. We saw something, Rebecca had said quietly, in the tunnel, a face in the stone, watching us. Dr. Aldridge had nodded slowly. Others have reported similar experiences. We think it's the tunnel itself or something that lives within the tunnels. An entity that exists outside of normal time, that can move between moments as easily as we move between rooms. We call it the Keeper. The Keeper, Eleanor had repeated. What does it keep? Time itself, perhaps? Or the barriers between different times? We don't know. What we do know is that people who've been displaced by the Keeper are changed. You've noticed it, haven't you? The way time feels different now? The way you can sometimes sense what's going to happen moments before it does? They'd all looked at each other in shocked recognition. Yes, they'd noticed. They'd thought it was just stress, adjustment issues, trauma, but it was more than that. Since emerging from the tunnel, each of them had experienced moments of temporal awareness. Eleanor finishing someone's sentence before they spoke it, Marcus knowing his phone would ring seconds before it did, Tommy sensing when someone was about to turn a corner before they appeared. You're chronologically sensitized now, Dr. Aldridge had explained. Your time in the tunnel attuned you to the flow of time in ways most people never experience. It's a gift, though it may not always feel like one. The visit had lasted hours. Dr. Aldridge had shown them her research, introduced them to other displaced individuals who'd found their way to the Institute. There was a man who'd jumped from 1876 to 1934, who'd lived through the Great Depression as someone perpetually bewildered by everything around him. A woman who'd gone from 1962 to 1991, who still expected nuclear war at any moment, and kept a fallout shelter stocked in her basement. A teenage boy who'd jumped from 1988 to 1993, who'd missed his entire adolescence in the space of a single night. They were a community of the displaced, people torn from their proper times and trying to make sense of a world that had moved on without them. And for the first time since emerging from the tunnel, James, Eleanor, Marcus, Rebecca, and Tommy felt like they weren't alone. They'd stayed at the Institute for 3 days, learning everything they could. Dr. Aldridge had taught them techniques for managing their temporal sensitivity, ways to ground themselves in the present moment when the pull of past or future became too strong. She'd shown them maps of known temporal anomalies, warned them away from places where the barriers were thin and another displacement might occur, and she'd told them the most important thing of all: you can't go back. I know you want to. I know you think about it every day, but the tunnel took you forward for a reason. If you found another temporal portal and tried to return to 1949, you'd either fail, the timeline would reject you, spit you out in some other time, or you'd succeed and create a paradox that could tear reality apart. Your time is now. Your place is here. The sooner you accept that, the better. It was Tommy who'd asked the question they'd all been thinking. What if we don't want to accept it? What if we want to fight? Dr. Aldridge had smiled sadly. Then you'll spend the rest of your lives at war with reality. And reality always wins. They'd left the Institute changed, armed with knowledge and burdened with understanding. They couldn't go home. There was no home to go to. Everyone they'd known was dead or old. Their world was gone. Their place in history had closed behind them. The tunnel had taken them, used them, and set them down in a time not their own for reasons they might never understand. But they had each other, and they had purpose now. Dr. Aldridge had offered them positions at the Institute, helping to document and study temporal phenomena, assisting other displaced individuals who found their way there. It wasn't the life they'd planned in 1949, but it was a life that mattered. James gave notice at the factory. Eleanor withdrew from graduate school. Marcus quit his consulting job. Rebecca closed her gallery show early. Tommy packed up his apartment. And in October of 1994, exactly 5 years after they'd entered the tunnel by the calendar, 5 months after they'd emerged from it by their personal timeline, they all moved to the Institute. They would spend the next years there, becoming experts in temporal displacement, helping others who'd lost their place in time, searching for answers about the Keeper and the tunnels, and the nature of time itself. They would build new lives, find new purposes, create a family out of their shared experience. But the tunnel wasn't finished with them. Not yet. Because on a cold November evening in 1996, 7 years after they'd entered it, and 2 years after they'd emerged, Dr. Aldridge's instruments detected something unusual. A temporal anomaly had appeared in western Pennsylvania, in the Allegheny Mountains, in the exact location where their tunnel had been. It was open again, and this time it was calling them back. The call came on a Tuesday evening just as autumn was giving way to winter. James was in the Institute's library, cataloging reports from displaced individuals across the country, when Dr. Aldridge burst through the door with an urgency he'd never seen from her before. "It's active," she said without preamble. "Your tunnel. The sensors I placed in the Alleghenies are going haywire. The temporal distortion is off the charts, stronger than anything I've recorded in 30 years of research." Within an hour, all 5 of them were gathered in the Institute's monitoring room, staring at readings that shouldn't have been possible. The screen showed massive fluctuations in the space-time continuum, all centered on the location where they'd entered the tunnel in 1949, or rather, where that location had existed, because in this timeline the tunnel had never been there at all. "It's creating a localized paradox," Marcus said, his understanding of geology now augmented by 2 years of studying temporal mechanics. The tunnel exists and doesn't exist simultaneously. It's forcing itself back into this timeline. Eleanor studied the waveform patterns on the monitors. Over the past 2 years, she'd developed a talent for reading temporal signatures, seeing patterns that others missed. "It's not random," she said. "Look at the rhythm. It's regular, purposeful, like a heartbeat. Or a summons," Rebecca added quietly. She'd been having dreams lately, vivid nightmares of the tunnel calling her name, of that vast face in the stone-opening eyes that had been closed for millennia. She hadn't told the others, afraid they'd think she was losing her grip on reality. Tommy hadn't said anything. He stood apart from the group, his hands shaking slightly. He'd been sober for 18 months now, but moments like this made him crave the oblivion that alcohol had provided. The thought of going back into that tunnel terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate. "We need to go there," James said, speaking the thought they'd all had. "If the tunnel is opening again, we need to understand why. We need to document it." "Absolutely not," Dr. Aldridge said firmly. "You 5 are the Institute's most valuable researchers. Your temporal sensitivity makes you irreplaceable. I'm not sending you back into the thing that displaced you in the first place." "With respect, Dr. Aldridge," Eleanor said, "I don't think we have a choice. The tunnel took us before. If it wants us back, it will find a way to take us again regardless of what we do. Better to go willingly, prepared, than to be snatched away without warning." The debate raged for 2 days. Other researchers at the Institute weighed in, some arguing that they should send a different team, others insisting that no one should go near the anomaly. But the readings kept intensifying, the temporal distortions growing stronger, and everyone who looked at the data came to the same conclusion. Something was happening, something significant, and the window to observe it was closing rapidly. In the end, they went. All 5 of them, just like before, but this time they were prepared. They carried Dr. Aldridge's portable temporal monitors, recording equipment that could function in high distortion fields, emergency beacons that would theoretically allow the Institute to track them across timelines. They wore specially designed watches that would continue to function even if time itself became fluid around them. And they carried each other's compiled knowledge, everything they'd learned in 2 years of studying temporal phenomena. They drove through the Pennsylvania night in a modern van, following GPS coordinates to a location that technically shouldn't exist. The closer they got, the stranger things became. Road signs showed different dates depending on the angle you viewed them from. Radio stations faded in and out, playing music from different decades simultaneously. Other cars on the road seemed to flicker, their designs shifting between modern vehicles and older models. "The temporal barriers are breaking down," Marcus said, watching his instruments go wild. "We're approaching a zone where multiple timelines are overlapping." They reached the location just after midnight, where in their memory there had been a massive tunnel entrance in the mountainside. There was now nothing, just forest, trees, ordinary rock. But the air shimmered with heat distortion despite the freezing temperature, and when they got out of the van they could hear it, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in their bones, in their teeth, in the very marrow of their existence. "I don't see anything," Tommy said, but his voice was uncertain, because he did see something, not with his eyes but with that new sense they'd all developed, that temporal awareness that let them perceive the flow of time itself. There was a weak point here, a place where the fabric of reality was thin as gossamer. Rebecca raised her camera and started shooting. Through the lens she could see it clearly, the tunnel entrance superimposed over the forest, existing in a different time but visible to those who knew how to look. "It's here," she confirmed. "Just not in our now." Eleanor checked her portable monitors. "The distortion is strongest at coordinates." She read off a string of numbers and they all moved toward that point, deeper into the forest away from the road. They walked for 15 minutes, the hum growing louder, more insistent. The trees around them began to look wrong, sometimes bare, sometimes full of leaves, sometimes covered in snow, as if all seasons were happening at once. James's watch showed the time jumping randomly, 11:47, 3:22, 9:15, 2:38, each glance revealing a different moment. And then they saw it. Not gradually, but all at once, like an optical illusion suddenly resolving. The tunnel entrance stood before them, exactly as they remembered it from 1949, massive and ancient and impossible. The crystalline formations around it pulsed with that same inner light, and the symbols carved into the stone seemed to writhe and shift as they watched. "My God." Dr. Aldridge's voice crackled through the radio communicator they carried. "The readings just spiked." "What are you seeing?" "The tunnel," James replied. "It's exactly like before, like it's been waiting for us." They stood at the entrance for a long moment, none of them quite willing to take that first step. They knew what lay beyond that threshold. They'd experienced it once, and it had cost them their entire lives. To enter again was to risk everything they'd built in the past 2 years. "We don't all have to go," Eleanor said quietly. "If anyone wants to stay behind, no one would blame you." But even as she spoke, they all knew it was a lie. They were bound together by their experience, by the tunnel's choice of them. Where one went, they all went. It had always been that way, and it would always be that way. Tommy was the first to step forward, surprising them all. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "If the damn thing wants us back, let's find out why." They entered together, crossing that invisible barrier where the sound of the forest vanished and the silence of the tunnel enveloped them. This time they were on foot, their equipment in backpacks, but otherwise it was eerily similar to their first crossing. The walls glowed with bioluminescence. The air smelled of ozone and stone and something older than thought. The symbols watched them pass with what might have been recognition, but there were differences too. This time, they could see other things in the tunnel, shadows that moved with purpose, shapes that weren't quite shapes, presences that watched from within the crystalline formations. And the tunnel itself felt different, more aware, more focused. It knew they were there. It had been expecting them. They walked for what felt like hours, though their watches showed impossible times. The tunnel descended in that same spiral pattern they remembered, but this time they could sense the temporal component of the descent. They weren't just going down into the earth, they were traveling through time, moving between moments like stepping between rooms. Marcus stopped suddenly, examining a section of wall. "Look at this," he said, pointing to symbols they hadn't seen before, or rather, symbols they had seen but hadn't understood. These aren't just decorative, they're functional. They're part of the mechanism that moves time. Eleanor studied them with her linguist's eye. They're instructions, she realized. The tunnel is teaching us, showing us how it works. As they progressed deeper, the lessons became clearer. The tunnel wasn't a natural formation and wasn't a constructed artifact. It was something in between, a living system that had grown through the earth over millions of years, feeding on temporal energy, creating pathways between different moments in time. The keeper they'd theorized about wasn't a separate entity. It was the tunnel itself, a vast intelligence that existed across all moments simultaneously. Rebecca's photographs captured things their eyes couldn't see, the flow of time visualized as rivers of light, the way past and future bled into each other, the faces of others who'd passed through the tunnel over the centuries. "We're not the first," she said, showing them an image that contained dozens of shadowy figures, all walking this same path in different times. This has been going on for a very long time. The tunnel began to change around them. The crystalline walls gave way to something else. Memories made solid, moments frozen in stone. They passed through chambers that showed scenes from history. Prehistoric humans discovering fire, ancient civilizations building their monuments, medieval travelers lost in time, Victorian explorers venturing into caves and emerging decades later. The tunnel had witnessed it all, had been the mechanism behind countless mysterious disappearances and impossible appearances throughout human history. And then they reached a chamber they hadn't seen before, a vast space at the heart of the tunnel where the temporal currents all converged. The walls here showed not the past but possible futures, timelines branching and diverging, each one a different path humanity might take. Some led to utopian civilizations among the stars. Others ended in nuclear fire or ecological collapse. Most simply faded into uncertainty, futures yet to be determined. In the center of the chamber stood 5 pedestals, and on each pedestal was an object. For James, it was his old engineering slide rule from the war. For Eleanor, a book of poetry she'd treasured in her youth. For Marcus, a rock hammer he'd carried on every geological survey. For Rebecca, the first camera she'd ever owned. For Tommy, a wrench from his father's toolbox, given to him when he'd first become a mechanic. Objects from their lives in 1949. Objects they hadn't seen in 7 years, sitting here in this impossible place as if waiting for them to return. "It saved them," Eleanor whispered. "When we traveled through time, the tunnel saved pieces of us, anchors to who we were." A presence filled the chamber, that same vast awareness they'd all sensed before. The keeper was here, all around them, within the walls and the air and the flow of time itself, and it was trying to communicate. Images flooded their minds. Not quite telepathy, but something similar. A direct transfer of information that bypassed language entirely. They saw the truth of the tunnel, understood its purpose. It wasn't trying to trap them or study them or use them. It was trying to save them. Time itself was breaking. The barrier between past, present, and future was degrading, worn thin by human progress and the relentless march of technology. Nuclear weapons had cracked it. The space program had stressed it. Computers and telecommunications and the accelerating pace of change were tearing it apart. Soon, time would become fluid, unstable, and reality itself would begin to collapse as different moments bled into each other. The tunnel had been created, grown, evolved, to prevent this, to maintain the barriers, to keep time flowing properly. But it couldn't do it alone anymore. It needed help. It needed agents who could exist across multiple timelines, who could perceive the flow of time and work to maintain it. It needed them. "You want us to be, what, time police?" Tommy said, speaking aloud what they were all understanding. "Keeping history on track?" "Not police," the presence seemed to communicate. "Guardians, healers. You have been temporally sensitized, attuned to the chronological currents. You can feel where time is breaking, where the barriers are weak. You can help strengthen them, help keep reality stable. And if we refuse," James asked, "then we all fall together." The images showed them the future that awaited without their help, a world where time became meaningless, where past and future happened simultaneously, where reality fragmented into countless contradictory timelines until existence itself lost all coherence. "Why us?" Rebecca asked. "Why choose us specifically?" "Because you were already lost," the keeper seemed to say. "You were dissatisfied with your time, searching for something more. We simply gave you what you were looking for, a purpose that transcends any single era. You were taken from 1949 and brought to 1993 not arbitrarily, but because 1993 needed you, because that was when the Institute existed, when Dr. Aldridge's research had reached the point where she could help you understand what you'd become. Every moment of your journey has been part of a larger pattern, a preparation for this choice. They stood in silence, processing what they were being offered or asked or commanded. It wasn't really a choice, not if the alternative was the collapse of time itself, but the keeper waited patiently, willing to let them decide. It was Eleanor who spoke first. If we agree to this, can we ever have normal lives? Can we ever just be? Normal is relative when you exist outside of normal time. But yes, you can have lives, relationships, purposes beyond this work. You will simply carry the additional burden of temporal awareness, of knowing what most people do not, that time is fragile and must be protected. And we'd be working for you? Marcus asked. The tunnel? With me, not for me, and with each other. You are a team, have always been a team. That is why you were chosen together. One alone could not bear this burden. 5 together can share it, support each other, maintain their humanity even while serving a purpose larger than human concerns. James looked at the others, saw the fear and uncertainty in their faces that probably mirrored his own. They'd lost so much already, their time, their families, their places in the world, and now they were being asked to give up even more, to take on a responsibility that would define the rest of their lives. But they'd also gained something. They'd found each other, found purpose, found meaning in a world that had seemed meaningless. And now that they understood the stakes, how could they walk away? Together, James said, and the others nodded. We do this together, or not at all. The keeper's satisfaction filled the chamber like warm water. You will not regret this choice. You will be changed, strengthened, given the tools you need to perform this work, and you will never be alone. I am always here, in every tunnel, every temporal anomaly, every moment where time touches itself. You need only reach out. The pedestals glowed and they each reached for their object, the physical anchors to who they had been. As they touched them, power flooded through them, knowledge downloading directly into their consciousness. They understood now how to read temporal currents, how to sense where time was weak, how to strengthen the barriers between moments. They knew the locations of every temporal anomaly on Earth, could feel the pulse of time itself, like a second heartbeat. They were changed. Still human, still themselves, but augmented, enhanced, made into something more. Temporal guardians walking between moments, keeping watch over the continuity of reality itself. When they emerged from the tunnel, it was dawn, though their watches showed they'd been inside for only 2 hours. The sun rose over the Pennsylvania mountains, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than before, more real, as if they were seeing the world with new eyes. Dr. Aldridge was waiting for them at the van, having driven through the night when they didn't return on schedule. She took one look at their faces and knew something fundamental had changed. Tell me everything, she said. So they did. In the drive back to the Institute, they explained what they'd learned, what they'd been offered, what they'd become. Dr. Aldridge listened in silence, her scientific mind struggling to accept what her instruments confirmed, that these 5 people were now reading temporal signatures with an accuracy her machines couldn't match, that they existed slightly outside of normal time in a way that was measurable but inexplicable. This changes everything, she said finally. The Institute's work, our understanding of temporal phenomena. If what you're saying is true, it's true, Rebecca said quietly, and showed her a photograph she'd taken in the final chamber. The image showed the 5 of them standing before the pedestals, but surrounding them were ghost images of thousands of others, people from across history who'd been chosen by the tunnel, who'd served as temporal guardians in their own times. They were part of a tradition that stretched back millennia, a secret society dedicated to maintaining the integrity of time itself. They returned to the Institute changed but determined. Over the following months, they began their new work in earnest. They would detect temporal anomalies before they became serious, would travel to places where time was becoming unstable, would use their newfound abilities to strengthen the barriers and maintain reality's coherence. It wasn't easy. The work took them around the world, to places where time ran strangely, ancient temples where past and present overlapped, modern cities where the future bled backward into the now. lonely stretches of wilderness where the boundaries between moments had grown dangerously thin. They would arrive, assess the damage, and repair what they could, weaving time back together with skills they were still learning to use. And slowly, they built lives around this work. James fell in love with another temporal guardian, a woman who'd jumped from 1867 to 1985 and understood what it meant to exist outside your proper time. Eleanor wrote books about temporal theory that became classics in the small community of people who knew such things existed. Marcus continued his geological work, now understanding that the Earth's deep structures played a crucial role in maintaining temporal stability. Rebecca's photographs became a record of temporal phenomena, a visual documentation of the secret history of time travel. And Tommy, staying sober one day at a time, became the group's anchor, the one who kept them grounded in the practical reality of the present moment. They aged, but slowly, their temporal sensitivity somehow extending their lifespans. By 2010, they looked perhaps 45, despite having been born in the 1920s. By 2020, as the world faced new challenges and time seemed to be accelerating for everyone, they were still there, still working, still keeping watch. And occasionally, when the work became too much or the burden too heavy, they would return to the Institute, to Dr. Aldridge, who had aged normally and eventually passed on, leaving the Institute to a successor who'd been briefed on the truth, and they would rest. They would remember the autumn evening in 1949 when they'd driven into a tunnel and lost everything they knew. And they would realize they'd actually found everything they needed, because they had each other. They had purpose. They had meaning. They were living impossible lives in an impossible role, but they were living, truly living, in a way they never had in 1949. The tunnel hadn't stolen their lives, it had given them new ones. Stranger and harder, but also richer and more significant than anything they could have imagined. They were the guardians of time, the wardens of reality, the secret protectors of a world that would never know they existed. They had entered a tunnel in 1949 and emerged in 1993 without aging a single day. And in the years since, they had aged not in the body but in the spirit, becoming something more than human, something necessary, something eternal. The tunnel still existed, of course. It always had and always would, a constant in an ever-changing world. And sometimes, when the temporal currents were particularly strong, it would call to new people, those who were dissatisfied with their time, who searched for something more. New candidates who might join the tradition of temporal guardians, who might learn to walk between moments, who might help keep reality stable in an increasingly unstable age. And when those new people emerged, confused and displaced and frightened, they would find 5 others waiting for them, ready to explain, to teach, to welcome them into a family that transcended time itself. James, Eleanor, Marcus, Rebecca, and Tommy had lost their lives in 1949, but they had found their purpose in every moment since, and they would continue that work for as long as time itself needed protecting, for as long as the tunnel called to those who were ready to answer, for as long as reality required guardians to keep it whole. They had entered a tunnel and traveled through time, and in doing so, they had become timeless themselves, not immortal, but essential, woven into the fabric of existence in a way that could never be undone. They were the story that history would never tell, the heroes that no one would remember, the reason that reality continued to make sense from one moment to the next. And that, they had discovered, was enough, more than enough. It was everything.